and welcome to the official Endnotes podcast, the only licensed podcast from the Endnotes Collective. My name is Uriah Mark Todoroff, and I'm joined by my co-host, Owen Gilbride. Owen, how you doing?
I'm doing great today. There appears to be a record sale going on outside in the alleyway, which is amazing because it was going on last week when we recorded the introduction for
We recorded the whole episode.
number 1. So I guess their business is booming. I'm happy to report that the great coronavirus recession is over.
Yeah.
Small businesses are thriving. If you want to start any business projects, now would be the time to do it.
Yeah, and really what this podcast is about is giving you business tips and financial advice. And this podcast is really for aspiring business people. And we're really all about helping you to understand the intricacies of capitalist society so that you can partake of it in a more, reflexive and mature kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Make that money, then blow it, as they say.
So what we're here today to talk about is the essay Misery and Debt on the Logic and History of Surplus Populations and Surplus Capital. This article was co-written by Endnotes and Aaron Benenev. So this is a really good essay. I really liked it. Pretty difficult. Got a lot out of it on the second read, but very technical and very compelling arguments. Owen, what do you think?
Yeah, whereas the first article in this collection, Endnotes 2, is a bit more of a primer. I feel like this one really gets into the nitty-gritty of how the processes that Marx outlined in the 1860s in his work play out in the modern age, written in 2010, but obviously still largely applicable to the present day. I enjoyed this essay quite a bit. It is quite technical. I would advise anyone who chooses to read this to go through it 2 or 3 times and take notes. But if you're committed, you can get a great deal out of it.
Yeah, it's also the essay that I feel like I've seen passed around the most, probably the most highest profile Endnotes essay, at least that I've seen. Actually, I read this many years ago when I was in university taking a Marxism class, not for that class, but it was recommended by a classmate, and read it then, rereading it now. It's great. Good shit. Good job, Endnotes.
5 stars.
Yeah, 5 stars. that's everything. I mean, spoiler alert, but we'll get into it.
Misery and Debt is it's primarily about something that Karl Marx refers to as capitalist accumulation, which, conveniently enough, I've actually been reading through Volume 1 of Capital for the first time this year. And as I was reading this essay, I was also reading the chapter that primarily introduces this concept, Chapter 25, The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation, where Marx goes over various tendencies of capital, such as the way in which larger capital sources will try to absorb smaller ones, and capital becomes more and more consolidated into large centers because it's a more efficient way of organizing it. And the nature of capital is such is that you always have to try to expand your holdings, or else you're going to be moving down in the market. So the idea of capitalist accumulation is something that Marx explores quite extensively, writing this in the 1860s about the process of industries continuously looking for new sources of innovation and ways to make the process of manufacturing products and rendering services more and more efficient. And if you look at this on a broad scale, ultimately what this leads to is more and more of the working population, the working class, becoming unemployed, and even a lot of low-level capitalists gradually being bought out or run out of business by more successful, bigger capitalists. So the process of capitalist accumulation is such that you're gradually growing this large surplus population that is unemployed or underemployed, and that this is actually in the interest of capital, because if you have a large surplus unemployed population, the people you do have working, you can keep their wages down because the unemployed population will be seen as competition. You can always point to them and say, okay, well, you need to work hard for this rate, because if you don't, these other guys will. And likewise, they need a large unemployed population because if a new project opens up, such as the construction of a railway, you need people who are hungry for work. You need people who aren't gainfully employed already, because it would be inconvenient to take them away from whatever they're already being employed to do. You need people who are desperate for work and will be willing to work for low wages. And now, over the course of especially in the first half of the 20th century, it seemed as though this trend that Marx described wasn't what was taking place. Because generally speaking, if you looked at capitalist nations like the United States, it seemed, especially up until about the mid-60s or 70s, that things were generally getting better. Quality of life was going up. Most people seemed to be relatively content, working a 9-to-5 job 5 days a week, and this was enough to have a home and raise a family with only one person working. And this was often pointed to as a reason why a communist revolution never took off in the United States, because things seemed to be going all right under capitalism. What this article outlines is that this process of things seeming to go all right was not an inherent quality of capitalism to course correct whenever it was getting a little too accumulated in one direction. And what this article shows is that there was actually a lot of distinct historical moments which allowed for this course correction. It was nothing inherent to capital itself, and that in the last few decades, it's become more and more obvious that the things that Marx outlined in the 1860s actually are playing out and getting worse.
So I think, like you were talking about Marx's Capital chapter on the accumulation of capital, and what this essay actually focuses on are two of the concepts derived from that. I think the concept of simple and expanded reproduction, which is kind of the lens that the author of this essay is using to look at the historical data provided by the 20th century and kind of argue for this Marxian economic idea of the rate of profit falling. It's like the aim of this essay, I guess. It's to argue, it's like a Marxian economics essay. I guess what I'll ask you is, I read Capital some time ago, but you're just reading it. So in this chapter 25, does he talk about the concepts of reproduction, like expanded and simple reproduction?
He actually brings those up in the preceding chapters. It's a simple, the whole 7th section of the book relates to the process of the accumulation of capital, and he starts off by talking about simple reproduction and expanded reproduction, the transformation of surplus value into capital, and then finally he spends quite some time talking about the general law of capitalist accumulation, and then he ends this section by looking at it playing out in different sectors of employment in the United Kingdom and the sort of effects that it was having in the real world. Marx likes to do this throughout his work, as he spends a great deal of time showing the real world manifestations of the laws he's discussing.
Right, and what I think is really cool and interesting about this essay is how they are kind of doing a similar thing. The concept of expanded reproduction, when they bring it in, it's really to account for the expanded marketplace and capitals that exist in other firms, as well as firms that are competing. They talk about intra-sectorial competition as well as inter-sectorial competition. So these capitals are moving throughout the marketplace, completely uninhibited. It's moving from one type of industry to another. So it's pretty interesting the way they use that concept to like when they first bring it in, it really gives this creepy impression of like a capitalist having some kind of like logic or like some almost like a will of its own, like it's moving around.
That is something that as soon as I started reading Capital, I was struck, because Marx does that as well, where he'll use terms like the spirit of capital, and you think at first that he's just being poetic, but then you realize in a sense he's being quite literal, because he talks about the individual capitalist, and he describes them as being nothing more than like the personification of capital itself. It is an interesting thought experiment to look at something like capitalism almost in the sense that God, because really it fills the same function. If you think about a god in a traditional society, they would stand for certain moral qualities, like maybe you would have gods that represented courage or wit or humility, or communities working together to get a certain thing, like whatever it was that the community would have thought would be valuable for its long-term survival. And capital basically does the same thing, where it's this idea that promotes certain values like innovation, industriousness, technological development, accumulation. And these are all things that if you subscribe to the idea of capitalism, and if you live in a capitalist society, it always is this force acting on your subconscious, compelling you to certain patterns of behavior, which ultimately just further prop up the system. It's he makes you realize that these spiritual concepts were always pointing to sort of emergent tendencies amongst like the collective population of the human planet.
All right. Well, on the note of seeking out basic survival, let's try to start at the beginning and go through this text.
All right.
So on the first page, they're in the like introductory section, they're talking about how over like in the 20th century, especially beginning in the 1950s after the war, you had this like golden age of state capitalism where there was just like so much prosperity and everything, and that also coincided with like a historically unprecedented move of populations from agriculture to modern industry. And then, like later on in the same section, at the beginning of the section, they are identifying Marx, like from what for Marx was the primary crisis of capitalism, the primary contradiction of it, which has to do with the relation of labor and capital. But let's try to read this quote here. The differentia specifica of capitalist economic crises, that people starve in spite of good harvests and means of production lie idle in spite of a need for their products, is merely one moment of this larger crisis, the constant reproduction of a scarcity of jobs in the midst of an abundance of goods. It is the dynamic of this crisis, the crisis of the reproduction of the capital-labor relation, which this article explores. So they're identifying like the reproduction of this relationship, the reproduction over time of the relationship between essentially like the boss and the worker, like the bourgeoisie, the class relationship that is identified by Marx. That is like the primary contradiction of capitalism that like causes all of these other types of crises, like temporary like booms and busts that like kind of bourgeois economists also identify. So that is like the like idea that is being explored by the essay, and from there moves on to the concepts of simple and expanded reproduction, which I think are like especially the concept of, expanded reproduction as a concept. They say that it's kind of like contained within the idea of simple, like you can't have simple without expanded. But I thought the idea of expanded reproduction was really interesting. Like it's like gives this picture of, as I was saying earlier, like capital moving around through the marketplace, like following its own kind of logic. But Owen, do you have any words to say on simple and expanded reproduction?
Yeah, okay. Well, in this section, they start off by acknowledging that the one essential condition, like the initiating sort of destabilizing force that gets capitalism going and gets this process expanding upon itself like microphone feedback, is that the general population must lack the means of reproduction. Basically, people can't just by their own means take care of their own basic survival needs, which for most of human history was the case, as this article makes note of, that the proletariat is a relatively rare and late occurring historical phenomenon. For most of history, people lived as peasants, sort of living off of food they grew themselves, on land they tended to themselves. They didn't really have need for money. And even in the feudal system, where they would have been required to give a great deal of what they produced to, a baron or a king or some sort of feudal lord, it was still a self-sustaining system, because the feudal lord could only take so much for his own satisfaction. I mean, if he took too much, his subjects would starve or they would stage a revolt, and that wouldn't be in his own interest. So even a greedy feudal lord would, if he had any sort of staying power, maintain some sort of a stable ecosystem. Under capital, that's not the case. As soon as you you need to separate a large amount of the population from the means of production. It says here, capital requires already present in the labor market a mass of people lacking direct access to means of production, looking to exchange work for wages. You basically need a large percentage of the population, as many people as you can get, in this position where they have no way of taking care of themselves, no way of providing for their basic needs, and the only option presented to them is to work for someone who does have those means of production, so that they can give them a wage which they can procure and take back some of what they're producing in order to just survive.
Yeah. I thought that section was really interesting as well. That idea really reminded me of Foucault, actually, and his concepts of biopower, and like the economism of like the way that power comes to express itself in this like in the movement from feudalism to what he calls, I think he calls it like sovereign, like that's the sovereign regime of power, where it's about like some like it basically he talks about how like it has to do with an expansion of the population beyond what like a king can really efficiently manage through like the system of feudal ownership, basically, of your serfs. So you need to like have the subjects themselves begin to do the own labor of their upkeep, which means like a market, like a kind of inevitably global market. But the idea of like when he talks about prison, he's kind of talking about the same thing. Like especially in the Panopticon, like the Panopticon is an example of like an extremely efficient like way of distributing power, because like the power doesn't even need to be present. Like the agent of power or whatever doesn't need to be present, because all of the people who are caught in it are like doing the labor of watching themselves. So just like in the marketplace, all of the workers, like the idea is to get the workers to be really dependent on the market immediately, so that they will then like get this system going and like create it as like this kind of self-perpetuating kind of thing where like they are doing the labor, really, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like the power is being like more efficiently distributed in a market relation than in a feudal relation.
They say later on in this section, they talk about something that Marx goes into detail a lot about, is how if the proletariat is compelled to take place in this system, the capitalist too is also compelled to take place in the system. So you can't really have, this like small town capitalist who opens up his corner store and just wants to provide things at a fair price to the townsfolk. Basically, under capitalism, if you want to be a successful capitalist, you need to be competitive. You need to be continuously looking to expand your market share. So, for example, if you were just, your humble small town corner store owner and you didn't care about making a huge profit, you just wanted to make enough to support your family and provide a good service to your neighbors, you will inevitably see something like, say, the Walmart Corporation moves in. This is exactly what Walmart did. It's this large source of capital that has access to more resources. It can buy in bulk at lower prices. It can make maneuvers with its reserve of capital that you as a small business owner wouldn't be able to do. So this big megacorp moves in, offers the same products that you're selling or a wider variety of products at a much lower price that you couldn't possibly match without going out of business. So inevitably what happens is people who are themselves trying to save money, because everyone's in the system of continuously needing more money, will inevitably start to shop at this more efficient, larger mega corporation, unless they have their own reserve of capital and want to become your patron and continue shopping at your more expensive independent business. You do see a bit of that, but generally speaking, what happens is these larger corporations can operate much more efficiently and put out of business anyone who just wants to own a store without necessarily becoming Jeff Bezos.
Right. Okay. So the idea so far is that there's this distinction between simple and expanded reproduction, and reproduction of the relationship between the capitalist and the wage laborer. So what is simple reproduction? What is the simple version of this? Capital prevents its self-conscious instruments from leaving it in the lurch, for it removes their product as fast as it is made from their pole to the opposite pole of capital. Individual consumption provides, on the one hand, the means for their maintenance and reproduction. On the other hand, it secures by the annihilation of the necessaries of life the continued reappearance of the workman in the labor market. So simple reproduction of the relationship between the laborer, the worker, and the capitalist is just their, I guess it's like their dependence on the market, and how by consuming things they need to go back to work or something.
Yeah, the market is such, the society that builds up under capitalism is such, is that it's always reproducing the necessity of capitalism once you're engaged in it.
Okay, so then from there you go into expanded reproduction, which is also simple reproduction, as it says here on page 24. For simple reproduction is, of its very nature, also expanded reproduction. Just as labor must return to the labor market to replenish its fund of wages, so too capital must return to the capital market to reinvest its profits in an expansion of production. So the expanded concept of the relationship between the capitalist and the laborer is to take on the perspective of the capitalist. Like once they have their profit, they can't really just go and spend it. Like some of it, profit is not what has to go back into maintaining the capital, but some of the profit has to go back into the market in some way, because because competition, I think they bring up competition as one of the forces. Why does the capitalist have to reinvest their money back into the marketplace? It has to always, as they say, it has to always be expanding its production, because of more aspects of the dynamic, which involve competition between different firms, which are constantly driving down prices. The idea of expanded reproduction, you really have to take in the idea of intra-sectorial competition, the idea that there's competition, so prices are always going down. We're also talking about reproduction, which means over time. So none of this can really be taken out of that framework. It is material, so it really needs to be considered in time. It has some identity in time, you know what I mean? So we can't talk about it without talking about it in time, which means that there's always going to be intra-market, intersectorial competition, which drives the capitalists to reinvest some of their capital, at least, back into the marketplace in order to retain some kind of competitive edge. Well, I guess from the idea of expanded reproduction, you get like just the necessity of like the driving of innovation is where that comes from. Like the more you're putting money back into the marketplace as a capitalist, like the more is coming out of that, which means innovation. Like you can't just again, because it's happening in time, so shit is happening, shit is going on. Like you couldn't just continually put your money into your railroad industry without it becoming more efficient.
Yeah.
Meaning that
you develop new technologies that can do the job. And even like without new technologies, I think that at some point Marx talks about a workshop where if you get a bunch of people together to do something, inevitably over time, they're going to get more and more efficient at the process. This is to some degree just human nature, that as we do things, we kind of streamline the process. We find better ways to do it. And I do think that's interesting to remember when you're talking about systems like capitalism, that to some degree, these tendencies play out just in general. Like, I think human beings do have this compulsion to like try new and better ways to do things.
Yeah. I mean, that's you're going to have to be able to make that argument as an anti-capitalist. Otherwise, like, you couldn't really have a marketplace, or you couldn't really have anything, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, you can only really make some sort of like primitivist argument, like let's just go back to the woods.
You have to be able to have some kind of concept of innovation in your capitalist utopia.
I'm not saying that like everything that happens under capitalism is inherently bad. It's not inherently a bad thing that technologies get developed and that things become more innovative. It's specifically the capitalist relationship itself that makes this a problem, because it just demands like endless rapid expansion at the expense of, the general health of the community or the planet. It's just reproduction for reproduction's sake. Right. To me, it's like an unbalancing.
An unbalancing of like a way more complex set of relationships. So moving on from that idea, which is that, the capitalist is putting their money back into the marketplace, which is like creating new types of like new technologies, which are first showing up, like they go on to say that those types of technologies, those types of innovations kind of like first show up as innovations that just kind of like increase efficiency within already existing industries, you know what I mean? Like they talk about like the power loom as an innovation on the, I guess, manual loom, and that like is still within the industry of weaving. It's like limited in a sense, but there are some innovations that become more generalized throughout society and open up entirely new like domains of activity, like electricity, that had to be, or like the software capital market, like the software industry was something that could only come into being because of these technologies that were developed for other purposes. I think that they talk about how like the microchips industry grew out of like defense and something else, some other kind of like manufacturing industry. So basically, you have like expanded reproduction, like as it goes on over time, as it went on over the 20th century, like it's opening up all these new industries, and people thought that the rate of profit would, like, despite the various booms and busts that happened throughout the 20th century, like people were thinking that the rate of profit could just like continue going on forever and we would all be fine. And that central contradiction that the rate of profit in capitalism is always going to be going down over time. seem to be disproven, but like obviously we've spoken a lot about how nowadays it's super proven. In fact, like the fact that we don't have any fucking jobs. But where do they go on from? I guess we're pretty deep in it now, so we're testing the extent of our knowledge. I guess the crisis of reproduction has to do with the reproduction of the working class, like they talk about here. The greater the social wealth, the functioning capital, the extent and energy of its growth, and therefore also the greater the absolute mass of the proletariat and the productivity of its labor, the greater is the industrial reserve army. The same causes which, to develop the expansive power of capital, also develop the labor power at its disposal. The relative mass of the industrial reserve army thus increases with the potential energy of wealth. But the greater this reserve army, the greater is the mass of a consolidated surplus population, whose misery is in inverse ratio to the amount of torture it has to undergo in the form of labor. The more extensive, finally, the Lazarus layers of the working class and the industrial reserve army, the greater is official pauperism. This is the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. So I guess where they take this idea of reproduction, expanded reproduction over the course of the 20th century has really borne out in the crisis of reproduction, which is the crisis of reproduction of the population, and how it ends up with this surplus population, which is like the industrial reserve army. They introduced the term consolidated surplus population, I guess, which is just like the people who are like absolutely permanently out of a job, I guess. Although that is supposed to be the lumpen proletariat, but I think they use it to talk about like service workers and whatnot. But anyway, you have most recently read Capital, the big book. So what is the Industrial Reserve Army? It's basically like there's a surplus population.
Yeah, you see this downward trend, right, with capital, as on the one hand, there's this accumulation, this upward moving trend of like the biggest sources of capital get bigger as they absorb smaller sources of capital. And as they do that, they're able to make their industries increasingly efficient. They can organize better, they can apply technology more directly, they can fund more technological development. So as there's this general upward moving trend, there is likewise a downward moving trend where more of the working class is thrown off, is the term that they use, where they gradually find less ready employment. There's a point in here where Marx talks about how you had like skilled artisans and like technical workers who were gradually replaced by automated labor, and how they were forced to do more and more menial tasks, like just being basic agricultural laborers on somebody's farm. And it does gradually create this large population of essentially unemployed people who are just this mass in reserve for when capital needs more workers than what it currently has, like if a new industry opens up. And I think this is what he means by the Industrial Reserve Army is, Marx uses the example, which would have been then current, of the building of railways, how as soon as this became a reality, you needed a lot of workers who were ready to just pack up and move and like dedicate all of their time to this project. So to a certain degree, it is in the interest of capital to have this population just on hand, on standby, where they're in this condition where they need to work. They're not going to just be able to go and say, okay, well, we'll just build some other society that operates on some other system of organization off on our own. They're kind of perpetually just living off of charity, living off of like whatever they can scrape up, the basic labor they can get.
I mean, that's what the welfare state was invented to account for, is the Industrial Reserve Army, like, so that they wouldn't just like die in the streets.
Yeah.
Has given us, thank God for liberalism. But So that is the idea of the Industrial Reserve Army in the Marxist sense is just like some workers who don't have jobs and are kind of used to like hold down the wages. I mean, I don't know if this is like a necessary aspect of their existence. I think there's probably some like more there's some like law regarding them more related to like the economic effects, but like one of the ways that they're utilized by the capitalists is to like negotiate against the workers. I guess like in bourgeois economics you have the idea that is not a real phenomenon. Like the argument for an industrial reserve army is very much like a Marxist argument that like just by its very nature, capitalism is unable to give jobs to everybody in society. There needs to be like not only are there like mechanisms that just cause it to like destroy itself and the world, but like it can't even like it's based on this like inequality among society. Like it simply cannot give jobs to everybody, which I think, I mean, whatever. It gives rise to a lot of this idea among like billionaires, like who cannot see outside of their capitalist framework that there is actually like they see the presence of a real existing surplus population, but because they can't see outside of their own framework, they think of it as something that needs to be like eliminated. That is like a holdover or something. It's like kind of like a useless appendage rather than something that is like inside the body.
No, this is something that I think Marx goes into at the very end of this chapter, where he's talking about the effects of capitalist accumulation throughout the UK, and he finishes this with about 10 pages dedicated to Ireland. And this part was interesting to me because my ancestors came over to Canada in the 1860s from Ireland, so this was personally relevant. I'm seeing my own history playing out here. How in Ireland you had this process where the most successful capitalist farmers began buying up more and more of the small farms around them. So you had this situation where historically all of these people who had tended to small plots of land for hundreds or maybe thousands of years were now in this position where they didn't have their own land anymore, and you just had a few wealthy farmers with like hundreds of acres, and people would work for them. But as you develop more technology, the process gets more efficient. You don't need that many workers. Like if you have one large farm that covers 100 acres, and that was the equivalent to 100 small farms, it takes far fewer workers to work that one large farm than it would if it was just a lot of small independent plots. So you began to see this situation where under the new system, there was just not enough work in Ireland. So suddenly, even though things had been sustained for a very long time, suddenly there's this huge overpopulation. And the capitalists blamed overpopulation for being the cause of all of society's woes. And this is why you had so many people being shipped over to North America, because it was this general mood of like, okay, we have too many people, we need to get rid of them, we need to move them over here. But this was only a problem created by capitalist development, by like, a few farmers becoming incredibly successful and making their process of tending their land incredibly efficient. And I think that to me reveals like the fundamental destabilizing force, where like the basic mechanic of capitalism is to close off systems that were previously working, previously sustaining the population, and to replace them with things that at best only temporarily kind of offset that take that population that was displaced by one thing and give them a new thing to do to sustain themselves. Very rarely does this thing that is replacing the old thing actually take on all of that displaced labor.
So, like the arguments, the bourgeois economists would argue against that. They would say that, like just by the very logic of the expanded reproduction, there are always going to be opening up there are always going to be new industries that are opening up and able to give these people who are thrown off by the old industry jobs again. But what their argument is, I thought it's pretty compelling. The argument that like that's just not going to happen. Like it's that like dynamic has diminishing returns, which I think it is very, on the face of it, seems plausible to me. Like the idea is that we're inventing new technologies that make it less and less necessary to work. So like we're not just going to keep fucking inventing like busy work forever,
which is what we're trying to do right now. To the point where even a lot of like online culture, I think like you have this weird situation now where I think like work disguises itself in other forms, where like in Marx's day, it was really obvious what work was. It was like this unenjoyable thing that you had to do to like provide for you and your family. And nowadays, I think with the gig economy, there's a lot of blurring where like the work, sometimes it's overt. Like if you work at a restaurant, like in this hot, loud environment, you know you're working. It's like uncomfortable and you're being paid to be there. But I think there's other things that are also taking on the role of work, like a lot of this idea of being a content creator, being like an artist, of like working to make it, is this kind of like workification. This is a word I just made up. Workification of like things that previously would have just been done for pleasure, for some like spiritual reason, or just because it made you feel good. Now everything's being turned into a process of like trying to make it. Everything's becoming part of the hustle. So if you're an artist, if you draw pictures, not only will you be sold products to draw pictures better, more efficiently, you'll also be encouraged to somehow turn the picture drawing that you're doing into a form of work, to try to get financial remuneration from it, to try to like put it into the market in a way that it's going to take off. So basically we've just become so fully entrenched in the capitalist mindset that now like,
right, so maybe in some future like society where capitalism has reached an equilibrium, like we will not be involved in doing any kind of like labor, any kind of like traditional manual labor, at least not like required to do it, but we will be able to like all have jobs by our very social existence being commodified like in every way, just by like existing and like moving through the world. Like all of our actions will be connected to some kind of like platform, some kind of network, so that it can be commodified, and that will be the job that we all have, and we'll all live like miserable lives according to how charming we are on the internet.
Yeah, like everyone will be attempting to show that they have the best, the funnest, most like aesthetically on point kind of like.
Even that would inevitably like results in fucking misery for so many people. Like there's no way that could possibly be good for everyone on the planet.
Because like the vast majority of people doing this aren't going to make it, and the small minority that do, what are they making? They're basically just like the ones who can best sort of embody the archetypical like ideal. Like I was thinking about like James Bond movies, and how like back in the day, whenever a new James Bond movie, he would always have like whatever was considered the coolest car and the coolest suit and like the nicest watch, and he was basically just this like archetype that you could project all of like
all of your male fantasies.
Yeah, like all of the sort of like acceptable hedonistic excesses that capitalism promotes as being like the ultimate aspiration of working so hard. Like you'll get to enjoy all this cool shit that James Bond has. And I think like the social media influencer has kind of taken on that role, where if you go on like Instagram or TikTok and see one of these like e-celebs who has like a certain look, and they get to go to certain places, they get to go to like the beach party down in wherever the fuck they go, and like the rooftop pool, and they're in some resort in Dubai, or like all the shit that you see on like social media that gets 10 million reblogs is just kind of like the modern day equivalent of that, where it's
right. But let's get back to this text.
Alrighty.
So here on page 32, I want to read another quote because I think it gets to what the hell they're talking about. If expanded reproduction indicates that workers and capital pushed out of contracting industries will try to find places in new or expanding lines, the general law of capital accumulation suggests that over time, more and more workers and capital will find that they are unable to reinsert themselves into the reproduction process. In this way, the proletariat tendentially becomes an externality to the process of its own reproduction, a class of workers who are free not only of means of reproduction, but also of work itself. So that is kind of like the heart of the argument of this essay, and it is like they're saying, they claim at the beginning that it is like what Marx identified as the central contradiction of capitalism, which is the reproduction of the relationship, between the two classes that really defines and makes the system able to move. But their whole argument in this essay is that, over time, that doesn't work. Like it is pushing workers and even capital. I thought it was interesting in this quote here where they talk about how workers as well as other capitals are pushed out of the marketplace and they are not able to reinsert themselves.
Yeah, this is like, if you look at the individual level, of course, you do have cases where, like, Bill Gates is just, when he was young, I don't think he had a particularly great deal of money, and then he ends up becoming the world's richest man. You can see this trait on an individual level where you could perhaps like move up in the system and accumulate resources. But if you look at like the broad spectrum analysis, like what like the working class is doing is working towards making itself gradually more and more redundant. This is like the general movement of capital.
Right, which is a contradiction because it's like an ethical contradiction because we're talking about the population of the planet. We're talking about human beings, every single one of us, just not being able to, like, having to depend on the welfare state.
Yeah.
And then also it's like a technical contradiction because you need workers with money to consume the commodities, otherwise like nothing is happening. Anyway, so from here I'm sorry for that. From here they go on. The next section is called From Re-Industrialization to De-Industrialization. Do you know what that one is about?
Yeah, this is I think where they start to get into the fact that in the 20th century, it seemed that like what Marx was looking at in the 1860s in Europe was starting to reverse, where after Marx's time, you had these things invented like the automobile and certain technologies, which did briefly lead to an expansion of the work market.
So reindustrialization refers to like that, like the second industrial revolution.
Yeah,
like in the 19th century.
Yeah, which is what like led economists to believe like, oh well, it looks like things are fixing themselves, and like maybe this is sustainable after all. There's a quote here that I've highlighted. So let's see if it's a good one. It was held that Marx's prediction of rising unemployment, and thus the increasing immiseration of the working population, had been contradicted by the history of capitalism. After Marx's death, the industrial working class both grew in size and saw its living standards rise. And again, this is like what was pointed to in the middle part of the 20th century as the reason why something like communism didn't really take off in the US, because it didn't feel like it necessarily had to. Most people were enjoying a quality of life.
That was the golden age of state capitalism in the 50s throughout all of the capitalist nations, but like especially America. That was the most prosperous like anybody has ever been, I think.
And that was in large part because of World War II, how after the war, America came out relatively unscratched, whereas like other countries, especially in Western Europe, were just ravaged. They had whole cities destroyed. America's doing pretty well for itself, and because of this huge increase in state spending, and a lot of countries owe it money, it was in a very good placement to sort of undo all of the negative effects of the Great Depression. Sort of the reversal of that reversal has taken place in the last 30 years, and I guess it'd be 40 years now because this article was written 10 years ago.
Oh wait, maybe this. I think this is where like they're making it more international. Like reindustrialization is putting more capital into the high GDP nations after the war, but then after that, like when the market becomes more global, they de-industrialize. Those high GDP nations begin to de-industrialize, and you see like the low GDP nations
take on the industrial role.
Like the role of manufacturing and all that stuff. Right. So this section is really about the change in work in the high GDP nations from like industry to service of a sort, and then the movement of industry to like the low GDP nations, which are traditionally, I've always called them the global periphery. I've always referred to it as periphery and center. Right, exactly. So moving on from here, the next section is surplus capital alongside surplus populations, which they as this whole process of expanded reproduction that we've been talking about plays out, as we just spoke about, like it is not only workers that are getting thrown off of the economy, but it's also capital. And like the focus of this essay has been on thinking about the population and like arguing how that consolidation of that surplus population is not an accident. It is not something that can be dealt with. It is an internal law of capitalist reproduction. But then, like, there's also the other thing to consider is, what is happening to the surplus capital that is getting pushed out of industries, and like as like the rate of technological development consolidates and like slows down and everything, and like we see like automation becoming more and more prevalent, and like the market is like really solidifying into all these monopolies, like which is what we see today, like just fucking unfathomable monopolies in the world. Capital is also being pushed out of the marketplace. So that is what this section is about, and it's not a very good section. Like
yes, I didn't highlight very much in this section.
It's really not like the focus of this essay. They say right at the beginning that they're going to pick it up as a concept in Endnotes number 3.
Yeah, they really just touch on this aspect here.
And it's written very like densely, but also like I felt like it wasn't being given a lot of focus, so I didn't feel very stressed about getting that much out of it. You know what I mean? Like,
and
I think that this essay is like quite. I mean, the first I got so much out of it on the second read. Like the first read, I didn't get too much out of it. Second read, I felt like I got a lot out of it, especially like the earlier sections where the focus of the essay is actually. Like I really felt like it was very clear, very well argued, lots of like, good arguments, and it was it was painstaking to read, but it wasn't difficult. Like it was difficult, but it wasn't impossible.
It's definitely readable. Like even if you don't happen to be reading Capital by Karl Marx concurrently to reading this essay, you could go into it dry and still get a lot out of it.
But I found I did like a little bit of searching on Endnotes, and they have this there's one like pretty long essay in the N+1 magazine that kind of summarizes their project up to number 4, I believe.
Okay.
It's good. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point in some future episode. Look forward to that. But a lot of the like discourse that I could find about them is, anarchists complaining about how unreadable it is, how like purposely obtuse it is or anything. But I don't think it's obtuse. It's just like it's talking about economics.
Yeah.
So like it's difficult,
And that's
right.
part of how it just keeps
we
going.
can't expect everybody to care about this shit, and I don't think there's anything wrong with not everybody wanting to read theory, like no matter how dense it is. I think everybody should read something, but not necessarily like dense or like theory, political content, philosophy of any sort. But like I think this text is very valuable to those people who are like interested in understanding capitalism. Like we're going to get. I mean, I'm sure they are going to get more into their like political program or whatever. We'll see if they have such a thing. But like, I think this essay is very valuable for people who take the time to read it to understand. It's like, what the hell is going on? Like it is giving an update to and like reminding you of these central contradictions of capitalism and how they're not going to be resolved, and therefore it's politicizing. It's like a polemic because it leaves no conclusion other than like you have to do something about the state of things.
Yeah, it's like not directing you to do something. It's simply like describing in some level of detail like what's going on. And I think that is very valuable to someone who has a similar mindset to us, perhaps, where they are interested and game to like dive into these dense and sort of ambiguous waters.
I know that's like their endnotes are ideologically part of the communization, like whatever you want to call it, ideology movement, which is like a left-com tendency. So there's essays. There are going to be essays in this book, I'm sure, that are going to give us more of a political program. Like this piece, which is co-written by Aaron Benenev, is just like doing one piece of theoretical labor. It's like one piece of the puzzle. But just to get through it, like the last section is about China, and like they've been talking about how like the movement of industry around the world, like as like manufacturing and production and that sort of thing, is like moving from the centers or the high GDP nations to the low GDP nations, and then like even there, like industry is yielding fewer and fewer returns. Like it is still becoming like more and more efficient in these like global peripheries. But in the final section, it's about China. So they want to consider like because China has like, I guess, been on an economic like rise,
built mega cities in the last few decades. So it seems to be like
it's like going up.
Yeah,
like they do so much of the world's manufacturing. So like maybe China is an argument against what they have been saying, which is that capitalism inevitably yields diminishing returns, and we're seeing it like yield fewer and fewer returns in our lifetimes. But is that true of China? And their argument is that China is also losing jobs.
Yeah, it's like they look at the statistics, and there weren't actually like the number of new jobs did not go up in China.
Yeah, it didn't go up at all between 1993 and 2006. Apparently, it stayed hovering around 110 million people. So that's that. Let's just read this little quote here from the conclusion at the beginning, just to like recap what this was about, and kind of like what it was responding to, which is like bourgeois economists. But today, many speak of a jobless recovery. But if the general law of capital accumulation applies, then all capitalist recoveries are tendentially jobless. The tendency of mature industries to throw off labor whilst facilitating expanded reproduction also tends to consolidate a surplus population not fully absorbed by the subsequent expansion. Then they go on to describe, it's the conclusion, so they're just going on to describe, everything that they've said about labor-saving technology, like consolidating and solidifying, and the marketplace solidifying, blah, blah, blah. And then, that's it. We're at the end.
That's about it.
Basically, the essay is about, how there's this increasing surplus population, and they actually don't have anywhere else to go. Not only that, but we've seen such an insane, unprecedented, totally random, unpredictable, just complete fucking acceleration of this process. It's totally been, by the pandemic, just jumped from something that maybe I personally, or you and I, would have been 50 or 60 before we really see a deep crumbling of what we're talking about here. But now, because of the fucking pandemic, all of a sudden, immediately, without wasting any time, the capital now has an excuse to get rid of so many jobs. Entire industries, sectors are fucking gone. The service industry is never coming back in the same way. And that leaves so much of the what they're talking about, the high GDP countries, fucks, because they argue about how as those high GDP countries push out manufacturing jobs, they're becoming increasingly reliant on service jobs. But those service jobs are suddenly fucking gone. They were going away, but now they're totally fucking gone.
Yeah. Which it's kind of scary to live through it, but at the same time, I wonder if maybe that's ultimately going to help. Yeah. It's like the idea of you put the frog in the water and you turn the heat up slowly enough so that the frog doesn't notice, which incidentally is not actually true. The frog will notice eventually and jump out. But what's just happened? See, I've sort of ruined my own metaphor, but what's just happened is they just cranked the heat and things just got a lot hotter, and maybe hopefully the frog will notice.
But just to point to a note of optimism is that that was several months ago at this point, and we're seeing a popular uprising against that, to the heroes of Portland and elsewhere, Minneapolis, New York City, every rioter who is out in the streets. I guess I dedicate this podcast. That's just an optimistic note to try to end on. There's a meaning. There's a movement that is recognizing the collapse of civilization and trying to do something about it. So that's a reason to be hopeful. But anyway, let's sign off. Goodbye, everybody.
All right. Bye, everybody.